the size of West Virginia. So you have everything from semi-desert, California, like, Northern California, right? You have, and then Southern California, you have everything in between, right? You have arid places, then you have humid places. So from one side of the country, you're growing, it's semi-desert, to the other side, it's subtropical. So it's very, very diverse, and everything in between. And the reason for that is that you have mountains. So 8,000 years of continuous winemaking tradition, 525 grape varieties that are unique to it, which all points to the fact that Georgia has a lot of wines for us to discover in the United States. And the good news is that they're good wines and that they're made in unique ways. So when you have 8,000 years of winemaking tradition, you realize that the way that we've been drinking wine for the last couple hundred years feels like it's old to us in the United States, but it really pales in comparison to what ancient wine really is. And so what I like to say is we have old world, we have new world, which is a product of the last 100 years. Old world is basically, for Americans, anything that happened prior to refrigeration. And then you have ancient styles of making wine, which we're going to go over today, kind of comparing the two. And ancient styles of winemaking are when you do things back before you had refrigeration, back before you had glass, back before you had wood barrels, back before you had stainless steel. And that's where you were burying wine in underground, in large clay jars buried underneath the ground, which are called qvevri. And I'll go through 3 qvevri wines that we can look at today. But I always think that it's really important is that is a super important part of Georgian wine, is that there's this ancient vessel recognized by UNESCO as the oldest specific winemaking vessel that's traced back to Georgia, that is also continuously used up until today. And that's just part of the spectrum. And that's what I love about Georgia, is that every kind of style of wine that you can think of, Georgia's been at the forefront of discussing, what wine is. They've always been maintaining that there's this ancient way of doing it and we should keep doing it. But at the same time, when oak barrels came in, they're like, yeah, let's give it a try. That makes sense, or when stainless steel comes in, they're like, yeah, there's a reason for making stainless steel wine. So what I love to see about Georgia is that it's the real place that has this continuum, and it creates this entire spectrum, and it just helps you orient. It's not that qvevri wines are better than stainless steel or modern wines are worse than ancient wines. No, it gives you the perspective that there's a lot of ways to drink wine, and they all have their own function and their own purpose. Some of them are more different for us. Some of them are more accessible for us. And that as wine educators, as I am too, I'm not here to beat you over the head with what I think is the best. I'm here to find out what works for your taste, and how do we show you and get you to dig deeper, than just the surface of what you're normally drinking. And I think all of you, of course, are people who care deeply about your beverages. I know that. And that's what I think what Georgian wine offers most people in the wine business, but even people outside of the wine business, is that it's a place to start, which kind of jolts you into awareness that this thing has a lot more to it than just, the 5 varieties that I know of, Pinot Grigio, Cabernet. And like, if I do pay attention, there's so much more that I can discover. And that's what I love about Georgia, is that it's a place where it's not pretentious to drink wine. It's a place where wine flows very easily, but it's very different wines, and some of them are challenging. And their reaction to that is, come on, join the party, grab a glass. Let's dig into this together. So that's a long intro, Drew. So I can talk
great. Yeah, and we definitely want you to, and I think what we've learned so far, especially like on the JVS side, is from our last call, was there's so much history here, and what you just touched on, and everything like that. Also, just through my research and the books I've read, so I've read For the Love of Wine, and that's a really fun read, and it's really kind of cool to hear different people's impressions, or to hear the author's impression of what Georgia was, and then kind of the introduction of the Georgian wine to the international market. I think the part that really stood out to me was when one of the winemakers was asked about terroir, and he didn't really understand the question, and they asked again, like, well, what is the climate like? And it's like, what's the ground like, what's the soil like? It's like, the soil is the blood of my ancestors, like, we've died here. And I think also, like, one of the cool things that I found through just some of my research was there's a lot of, obviously romanticizing of the wine. And one that I read that I thought was really cool is a legend relates to how soldiers wove pieces of grapevine into their chainmail, protecting their chests. So then if they died in battle, a vine sprouted not just from their bodies, but also from their hearts, which I thought that was just like super cool and like totally metal as well. Um, are there, I mean, I would assume so. Are there more stories that kind of stick out to you that are like that, kind of like legends of Georgian wine that, are just really kind of cool and fun and that you like to share with people when you're drinking Georgian wine?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, that's a great segue into the first one that I want to talk about, because it's exactly with that mindset that how this brand and this way of telling that story easily to other people kind of came about, which is the first wine that I'm drinking, sorry that you aren't, is Guardians, which is the Guardians of wine. The idea is that Georgia has been defending wine for 8,000 years, and this is the 100%, this is the Rocatatelli, but this is a European style wine. And why it segues into what hey, look at you, Summer. Summer's drinking it. Why it segues into it is that there are tons of stories. And so when we talk about 8,000 years of winemaking in Georgia, Georgia sits on the Silk Road. So it's the one way prior to, discovering a lot more geography that people could get from Asia to Europe. You had to go through Georgia. And so that meant that Georgia was a very fertile place, right? It's a really place. That meant that everybody wanted Georgia, right, for their control, because they controlled trade routes, right? So Georgia has literally been the capital city, which wasn't even the capital city the entire time, was burnt down 19 times. And that's because every single invader that you can think of, and most of us can't even think of that many because I'm bad at history, but Georgian history will teach you that every single invader that you've heard of, okay, you think Alexander the Great, yep, was in Georgia. You think, but prior to that, you have all the Khans, right? The Mongol invasions. How did they get to Europe? Right through Georgia. How many were there? You think of Genghis Khan, you think one. Actually, there's like 10 of them. There's 10 different Khans that came and made their way through Europe in different times. Then you have the rise of Persia, right? Persia is Georgia's direct southern neighbor. Armenia is the border, but of course, they were taken over by Persians many times as well. So Persia becomes on the scene, right? And it's taking parts of Georgia. Then later on, you have the Turks, then they become a power, and the Persians and the Turks are fighting each other. And then you have Russia, which is the latest, and which everybody knows, but Russia has no influence in Georgia up until the last 225 years, because there's a huge mountain range that divides Georgia. Then you have the Russians coming down and taking and annexing Georgia. That's all to say about the legends, is that the legend of tying your vines there, true, is that Georgia is just rich with poetry and history, and all in the way that that's celebrated is over wine. So you have this tradition of supra. And so the Guardians of Rocatatelli, what we did with both the three Guardians wines is that we wanted to honor some of those legends that didn't necessarily tie directly to wine, but kind of gave you the sense of the spirit of Georgia. And what we really like about this is that it really focused on women, because obviously in Georgia, it's a quite patriarchal society, but there's this huge love of women. There's this kind of strange duality that exists in patriarchy, but there's this huge love of women. And often they were not allowed to be sort of front winemakers, even though they were actually making wine most of the time. My experience of going to Georgia the first time is almost all the wines I drank were actually made by women, but they were presented as this family's wine. And so on the Guardians of Rocatatelli and then the Guardians of Saperavi, we honor two women from history who kind of are that spirit, which is that in Georgia, you love wine, you love your country, you love your language, and you're ready that people are going to come and try to take it. You're ready that they're going to come and rip up the vineyards first, which is what the Persians did. It's what the Mongols did. They came, they saw, oh, wine's important to you, we're going to burn the vineyards, right? And what Georgians did is exactly what they said, is that they would literally take the gold and precious objects from the churches, right? Which is Georgia's an Orthodox Christian country, the earliest state religion or Orthodox Christian country, really, 4th century, prior to most of the people that we know. So they converted to Christianity in the 4th century. So they have all this ancient manuscripts, all this treasure. So when invaders came, they grabbed all the stuff from the church. And then what do? They grabbed grapevines and they went high up into the mountains, way high into the mountains, to the places that they only knew, to these hidden churches and these hidden caves that they had. And they brought it up there. And there's a specific place called Swaneti, which is still kind of like they call it like the slow region. There's lots of jokes about Swaneti. It's like you go and try to talk to them, they don't understand. But the idea is that they literally would take all the treasure, bring it high up into the mountains, let people invade and pillage and do whatever they had. And then knowing that we're going to find a way, maybe it's 100 years, maybe it's 50 years, but we're going to find a way that when we come back down, when we get these guys out of here, we're going to plant it. So Layla is an example of this. So this woman here, this is our rendering of a woman called Layla. Literally, we went and researched to the National Museum. This is an actual dress that's from a very specific region called Khefsureti. You can actually go and see this very dress in the National Museum in Georgia, in Tbilisi. And Khefsureti is known for these bright colors. And so the legend of Layla is passed down by the most famous Georgian poet. So in Georgia, poetry and wine, these are two very connected things. And so when you go to this capital city, the streets are not named after politicians. They're named after the most famous poets that are in Georgia. And so every kid learns poetry at, again, at the super table when you're feasting and eating. The two most important components are saying toasts and then reading poetry and singing songs. And so Layla was kept by, this story was passed down in an epic poem called by Vajab Shawala. And basically she's a woman who, she's the son of a fighter. Both of these people are are daughters rather of very famous warriors. There's invaders coming. She wants to help. The city's like, you're a woman. We know you're really good at fighting, but we can't put a woman in battle. What would they think of us, right? And Layla, together with she has a friend who understands that she's probably the only way that they can win. So he breaks the rules of the society, grabs her and says, hey, we need to come up with a plan. And so she goes behind enemy lines, kind of like, some other stories you might have heard. She goes behind enemy lines and dies opening the gates so that there's a night raid and ambush. And the reason why that's connected to wine is it's the same idea, is that Georgians have this spirit where, and like wine is our blood, you can try to take everything for us. You can try to take anything from us. But what we want you to know about us is that winemaking is, I don't need to think about terroir. I don't need to go deep down into what's in my soil, which I think as a wine person, I wish that they would do more, but it really is just their idea is that like, this is a gift from God. I do it because that's who I am, and I'm going to defend it to the last. And that's just very similar to the kind of the spirit that's there in Layla, but you do it in sort of beautiful poetry rather than just that. But then the other great legend that, many Georgians have in their creation myth. Their creation myth takes place with wine as well, which is namely that, Georgia is very beautiful. I hope that all of us will be able to freely travel to Georgia sometime soon. But the creation myth is that, when God was creating the different countries in the world and giving it to different people, he had set a time. He said, you guys, you want some place to live, you have to come, to Friday at 6. And everybody comes at Friday at 6, and he hands out different people. And of course, the Georgians, they come late. And God says to them, because if you know Georgians, they're always late. So he says, we call it Georgian maybe time. He comes to the Georgians, he says, you're late. I gave everything away. There's nothing left. And he says, why were you late? They say, well, God, we were late because we were eating and feasting and drinking your toast and honoring you. And we lost track of time. And God, it struck God's heart. And then God said, well, I was saving this place for myself, but I'll give it to you. And that's Georgia. So that's the Georgian creation myth, is that it was Georgians' love of God and toasting for them is what saved them. So those are some of the many myths. But we'll talk about Maya, who's basically the Georgia's version of Mulan, which if you want to get to the real deeper story and not the Disney stories, you know, tragic and also beautiful. So, you know, there's always a little bit more nitty gritty to it. But there's so many stories to be told, both ancient stories, but also modern stories of amazing winemakers who are doing great things now. And they're doing it simply because they don't know any other way. That's how they do it. So that's some legends.
So, you know, you guys are talking about like going in and wanting to create these wines with these legends in mind. What is your guys' role in this scenario? I mean, is it to go in and meet winemakers and be like, hey, we have this idea, or is it like, hey, you make this great wine, let's collaborate? What's the process
Right.
of you guys going in and developing these wines for these people?
Yeah, for Guardians, is that we want to have a wine that so we want to be able to start telling that story more broadly, you know what I mean? And the question is how to do that authentically and do that well. So we primarily started working with a winemaker who we have experience with, right? Who we know makes amazing Qvevri wines. And we are also trying to encourage the sort of medium to larger size people in Georgia who are making good wines about, you know, how to tell their story. Because a lot of the time, the medium to larger people in Georgia, which is the most modern history, is that they have direct markets to, say, Russia or post-Soviet markets who care not so much about the quality, right? And they're drinking it because during the Soviet Union, you got Georgian wine, right? And that's because the state produced Georgian wine and that you had no other option. It was like Moldova, Georgia, you know, Bulgaria maybe, but Georgia was made sort of famous in the Soviet Union as the best wine. Now, was it always the best wine? Probably not, right? Because you have industrial winemaking, right? It's whatever needs to get done. And so for us, it's like we see traction, but you know, the average person isn't necessarily going to spend $30 on a Georgian wine, right? Which is amazing value for what it is. And so the goal for us was, how do we help these winemakers tell their story in a way that's honest and unique, but also points them to what's next. So with the Guardians, we had the same idea. We work with some women winemakers in Georgia. I think they're the future of Georgia, right? But there's only a few of them that are now. There used to be 5. Now there's a group of 12 or 15, right? But that's still too few. So we were like, you know, how do we you know, help the people who need to sell wine now and are making good wines now, but how do we guide them towards what's next for Georgia, which is empowering 50% of the other population that already is involved in this work to see themselves as, you know, producers as opposed to just behind the scenes, right? So that's what we did with this, is that we had this idea that we need to have wines, yes, at a certain price point that can bring in people in. You know, your average Pinot Grigio person, if you set them down an intense skin contact wine and you say, this is Georgian wine, and that, you know, 60% of them are going to be like, I don't like this because I have no reference point for this at all. And then they're going to say all Georgian wine is weird and crazy and I'm not interested, right? And what we see ourselves as importers is we're storytellers, right? And I want Georgia to, I want as many people to know about Georgia and have positive feelings and get interested. And I'm okay with the fact that if I bring them a wine that's Ricatatelli, that's stainless steel, that is clean and bright, right? They can at least understand that. And then the goal is when they trust me in that, then I can say, try this one next. And this is completely different, but you know, now you're interested. Now you have some sort of reference point, right? So that's kind of what we did with this, is that we worked with 2 young winemakers. Temur Dakashvili is the main guy that we work with right now, but we hope to maybe expand to create 3 wines that are representative of the variety, you know, so that I can say in this tasting what we're doing today is, okay, let's taste a Ricatatelli with no skin contact. So that's a big thing about what we'll talk about today is skin contact. Is like, let's taste one. Let's taste what the variety just tastes like by itself. You know what I mean? And then I contrast it. You need that kind of wine to sort of contrast it to what skin contact is. You know what I mean? So we worked with them to create wines. They had wines already. We kind of just tasted through and just said we thought that this would work. And then we tried to help them tell the story other than, something that's impronounceable and, it doesn't necessarily isn't as connected. So the way the Guardians works is that every now it has 3 pillars. Everything that we sell every year, we donate. We donate a profit either to the Wounded Warriors Fund, which is Georgia. That's another thing. Georgia is the largest non-NATO contributor to the NATO force in Afghanistan and Iraq. They had our, feel what you feel. Obviously, some of you know that better than me, but Georgia has a huge amount of contribution to that, and there's many people close to us, which are in the national health in Bethesda here, who are warriors who have been wounded. So we either donate part of that, kind of the warrior story, and we also donate a portion of the profits to an organization that promotes young women to become entrepreneurs in winemaking. So that's our kind of goal, is to take people who already know the craft and how can we help them expand what the future is for Georgia. And so we kind of tell them that, and we say, our vision of wine is something bigger, and we think it matches up with you, and that's how we did that. So this has been a project that we started about 3 years ago, and we try to do it slowly, and not about making a bunch of money, but it's about finding ways to grow sustainably, and find those next winemakers. So that's kind of how but it's also really important to have, like I said, on the market wines that just show, that are made stainless steel, kind of clear, bright, makes sense to people. They're at a price point where they're, about $14, $15, where people want to spend for a premium wine, but they don't want to. And then once they trust you, then they're like, oh yeah, I'll try the Saperavi that's $30, after I've tried one that really impressed me when it was at 15. So something like that.
So so that's the strategy then, because obviously when you're, a lot of us have walked into different places with, crazy wines and hard to pronounce names and stuff like that. And that's kind of like the mindset that you're working with, is that we're going to get them in the door with something that's a little bit more approachable and a little bit more familiar. And
Right.
Then we'll work them up to kind of the crazier stuff.
Well, in the sense that, yeah, that, you all know, like the vendors, the wine shops that you love that have the crazy stuff. And we go there because we're turned on to it. It took us, years, or it took somebody doing that exact thing to you, which is namely they presented you a spirit, or they presented you a wine in a place you felt comfortable, and they like wowed you, and you realized there's more to this, right? So the question is, is your average wine shop gonna put the skin contact in front of people? You know what I mean? Or are they more likely to put this in front of them, and then once they see people's positive reaction and interest? So it's both about making retailers understand that the market is changing and there are more and more people who are really interested, and you have to cater to them. If you don't, you're gonna, eventually, maybe 50 years from now, you're gonna be having a smaller market, you're gonna have a smaller reach, and that the market of art is moving towards smaller, interesting wines. But at the same time, not everybody, like I said, not everybody's dropping 20 to 30 bucks a day on their everyday bottle of wine, right? So even the people who love crazy funky stuff are still buying wines at 12, 15 bucks, right? So it's about how do we provide options both to our loyal customers, but also at the same time, expand into the more average wine shops and teach them that they need to be paying attention to Georgia and to this part of the world, because it's up and coming and people are interested. There's clients out there. So that's a little bit of the business side of it, but my main goal is that I would like every American who's drinking wine, I'd like them to have at least tried a Georgian wine. You know what I mean? And I think that's a little bit ambitious, but why not? Why not have them try something that is absolutely different? And I'm fine if half of them don't go down the rabbit hole, but even if just 10% of them go down the rabbit hole, that's great for Georgia, because Georgia, they produce about 80 million bottles of wine. It's a small, premium sized country, and the goal is, can we help grow a lot of the people that are really small? There's a strange dichotomy in Georgia that was created by the Soviet time, where you have large wineries that are like 7 to 8 million bottles, and then you have the majority of wineries that produce less than 3,000 bottles. I mean, that's one shop could sell these, those bottles of wine, right? And so the goal is, how do we take this big crop of like really good winemakers, and for those who want to grow to what we would call like a normal size winery, or a small winery in the US, which is like 30, 40,000 bottles, which is where you can make a living full time, because a lot of those winemakers don't make a living on wine. They just do it out of passion. And how can you help them create economic stability so that they can produce 20, 30,000 bottles of wine and export it at, again, not a super premium price, be on the shelf at $30 or be on the shelf at 25, but they have enough sell through, to create sustain. So once we move, 12 or 15 of those people up to that next category, that means quality is better, the stories are better, you know what I mean? So that's part of, that's economic development. And to be honest, I just look at it from that whole perspective, is that I want my business to succeed, but the greatest thing that I would have in Georgia is to see that, like, the real, the 10 or 12 best winemakers that I see are out there, seeing them be able to have a sustainable life on what they love doing. That's what it would be all about for me, and so that's part of that. What we realize is part of that strategy means bringing more people in. Do you know what I mean? And that's kind of why we look at it holistically. Is like, we need to have really quality wines that do at $12 to $15 with a story that can engage that person who knows nothing about Georgia, so that they can then move on to supporting both economically, but also, Georgia, but also in the Georgian wine market, but just really move deeper and be the next person who they're going to tell their friends that this is a really cool thing. You should pay attention to this. And I think just, fundamentally, if you give them the truth that Georgia is the birthplace of wine, and then you also give somebody a good wine that resonates with them, that's pretty much all we need to do in Georgia. And the good news is we have both of those things. We have that authentic story, and we have good wines. And our goal is connecting people to that.
Yeah, and so with these, being such a part of the lifestyle for Georgians, and even here in America, there's very much so like the wine tasting, the cheese, the meat plates, and stuff like that. I find that sometimes it's beneficial to kind of give people a roadmap when it comes to pairing these wines and stuff like that, because not only are we dealing with something that's a little bit outside of the norm, but like, what are some things that you like to pair these wines with that can make it a little bit more approachable and just kind of give it that familiarity that maybe the wine itself doesn't have, but then maybe the pairings do. So you're like, hey, this is really good with this, bring that in, and then eat and drink this together.
Totally. Pairings are a big way that Americans understand wine. There's no doubt. The fun part about Georgia is that they have the complete opposite idea about pairings, which is namely that they're, I guess, less refined is what you would say, but Georgians would make the claim that they're more refined. But they're less refined in the sense that they don't come up with this ideas of pairing one wine per dish. You pick a wine at the beginning that's going to do what? Go with all of the food for about 4 hours. B, is going to make you feel not as terrible the next day, and 3, that you actually like to drink, right? And sometimes there's a lot of wines that people love to pair, but they don't actually love to drink. Do you know what I mean? And for Georgians, that doesn't make sense for them. Like, so they're not. So what, for example, what I'm gonna pour in my glass right now, which is skin contact wine, right? Skin contact wine, darker color. This is a white wine that's been aged on the skins. Most people call it orange wine. We prefer to call it amber wine because it doesn't make you think of oranges. And it's how we've been calling it in Georgia for thousands of years. It's called Cannabis Peregrino. And so skin contact wine, why is this invented in Georgia? Well, there's lots of ideas, lots of theories. But one of the most probable ideas that it was why you would add skins back to white wine is that you found out that it lasted longer. And that's really important in Georgia, is that you want to be drinking wine as much as you possibly can, right? And what's coming up in Georgia, so this is a wine that's been aged on the skins for 6 months. And why was it aged on the skins for 6 months? Well, it was partly because they wanted to. It was partly because of the society that they were living in. And it's what I love about that is it's a really human invention and discovery from one particular region. So this wine was picked in October or end of September, beginning of October. It was pressed into the ground into large clay jars. The skins and the seeds were added back into the juice. It fermented for about 14 days. Once fermentation was done and malolactic seemed like it was kind of through, these guys added a tiny bit of sulfur, like 10 parts per million, which is nothing basically. And then they closed up the clay jar from the air and let it sit until about next week or 2 weeks from now. Why did they let it sit for 6 weeks, for 6 months? It's about 6 months. Why? Well, because from February until April or February into May is a season called Lent, in which Orthodox Christians are fasting from meat and dairy. They basically go vegan for 40 days. Actually, it's more like 50 days, but 40 strict fast days where they're not allowed to drink. Of course, Georgians are still drinking, some of them, but technically they weren't supposed to drink. And what happens is then there's Easter. And Easter, then there's 50 days of feasting. So you open the qvevris, and these are large clay jars, right? There's hundreds of liters. And when you open wine and you don't have bottles, right? There's no bottling, but thousands of years ago. The way to preserve the wine was both to have the skin contact on there, to have it very tannic, also to have exposed the wine to oxygen early on in your white wines. Again, it's a big no-no now because you want to keep that bright, crisp fruit. The Georgians discovered if I do open air fermentation, they didn't have temperature control, but they I don't know if they discovered, but it's now we're discovering that if you expose white wine to oxygen earlier on in its life, it's more tolerant of it later in its life. And so they had open air fermentation. They had this skin-to-skin contact. Partly it was because of the taste, but partly because they realized if we do it, we open this 800 liter thing, we only have a certain amount of time to drink it. And so we got to drink it a lot, So this is all about pairing. But that to be said is that it's also, why did they do 6 months? It's because in this region, which is called Kakheti, what kind of foods do they eat? They eat shepherd foods. They eat heavy, fatty foods, meats, right? And they like to drink a lot. And their red wines, which are the Saperavis, are very heavy and are very complex. And so they like drinking wines that pair with meats, with fatty things, heavy things, just like a red wine would, but it's lighter. And it's, even though it's heavy for a white wine, it's still lighter than a red wine. And you feel like you can actually drink a couple liters of it, which is what you're expected to do, at a Georgian feast, which is what you do from April until June, which is until the next fast. So that being said, skin contact whites, which I think are really dovetail into what you're asking, which is like, how do you pair these wines? Because everybody thinks white wine for fish, red wine for steak, like which is actually not true, right? But it's easy to remember. Something like this wine kind of really blows that up. And what I love to do when I talk about people with pairings is like, well, open this bottle and, while you're cooking, eat it with some of the cheese that you had, eat it with some of the vegetables you just roasted, eat it with the meats that the braise that you were doing, taste it with everything. And you will find that this wine has, because of its acid, because of its tannin, and because of its sort of more oxidative nature, it's going to go with both all the savory kinds of foods. But in general, the best sort of pairings are with pork, fatty cuts of pork, things that are rich kind of cheeses, more funky cheeses are really great with it as well. That's typical of this region. But, the first one that we had, a straight up ricottatelli, it's bright, it's crisp. You're having that with salad. You are having it with fish, but it's got enough acid that it can go with meat. It could easily go with pork as well. And that's what I do a lot of the times in the kind of tastings or wine dinners that I do, is I literally pour these side by side and say, hey, we've got some fatty pork. Taste that one. And you're like, oh, this is great with pork because it cuts through the acid. The acid cuts through and refreshes your palate. And then this one, you can say, oh, this is great with the pork as well, because it's got tannin that allows the fat that's coating your mouth to roll off. And you get all these sort of secondary notes where you're getting ripe dried apricot, you're getting spices, sweet spices, and all sorts of things. And it's a really good way, Georgia's really good at that, is saying, take what you know in terms of pairing and apply it, but then experiment in this different way. So I always find it difficult as a wine salesperson is like, how much do I give somebody a dish and be like, okay, it tastes great with pork kebab, Are you going to go home and make pork kebab? I don't know. I always struggle with pairings. Pairings are like my love-hate thing in wine because it's like, I can put them on my website, but most likely people are going to drink wine with whatever they have. And if you give them this idea, okay, it's fat or it's acid, right? Then that's easier for people to understand. But at the same time, I know it's important for people. They want to be like, oh, this is my pizza wine. And you're like, yes, this goes great with pizza. So it depends on the person. But so I could give you specific ways, but what I love about Georgian wine, especially skin contact wine, is that really pretty much anything you throw at it is going to open up another facet. There are some things that it doesn't go great with, right? There's no doubt, like any wine. It doesn't go great with dessert, right? So, but it is going to go great with a lot of different things. And that's what Georgians love about pairings, that they say, we're going to drink this wine for 4 hours and you're going to go on a journey and you're going to see, oh, does this wine go well with that? Does that wine go with that? They're like, it's more about you discovering it as opposed to you getting the specific recommendation and saying, well, if I'm going to drink Riesling, I have to have X, Y, and Z. Or if I'm going to drink Ricatatelli, I have to have X, Y, and Z, and I can't have it with other things. And they're like, no, try for yourself. Does it work? Does it not work? You get to decide, you know what I mean? So it's a little less expert down, more of that. And so there's something about, I don't know, I've walked around your question. If anybody wants to know specific recommendations, I'll do it. But those are the usually how I approach that question is.
No, I think that's perfect because it's, when you give a little bit more of like the broader terms, you kind of let people interpret that, and, not putting it into a box is how, I like to go about things. And then more so not with like tasting pairings, but more so with like tasting notes. Like I hate when people ask me for tasting notes because they're so personal, and something that I think is awesome, you might hate.
Yeah.
So I don't want to, like you said, I don't want to put something in their mind like, oh, this can only go with this or this can only go with that. So that makes actually a lot of sense to me. And I think definitely from a sales perspective, that's perfect because like you said, like you're saying all of these things and you just talked for the past 4 minutes but did you say anything at all? I don't know.
Yeah.
So that's
or I could do the better salesman person, say it goes great with lamb. Go out and buy some lamb. I'm helping out the Australian, New Zealand industry. There you go. What I mean?
Yeah. That's where you just put in your little personal bias.
Go ahead.
I think one thing that I would like to dive into a little bit more is really the process, and in particular the cuvées, because those are so unique in terms of like what we're exposed to, especially here in California, where I'm up in Sacramento, so I'm an hour from Napa, then I go 45 minutes the other way and I'm up in the foothills, so I'm surrounded by all this wine. And when I was introduced to the concept of a cuvée, which was very recent, I was just like, the hell is that and why? So if you could get a little bit more into that, I'd love to kind of hear your little spiel when it comes to talking that.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess what would be helpful is to, maybe I'll just share the screen just to give some people a sense. I have to say yes to you allowing you. Yes, I will allow you. If I can figure it out. Well, in case somebody doesn't know what a cuvée looks like, that's the main question. But let's see if I can get my technical details of opening my system preferences to allow you to do this. And I have to say yes. Hold on. See if it'll let me do it while we're on here. Cuvées are large clay jars, as I talked about, but it's sometimes helpful to see, see how they look. Let's see if we can make it work. Share screen, let's try it. Yes, awesome. So let's do desktop 1. Can you see it? I think you can. Okay. So I'm going to put you guys over there and I'll tab it. See my SBA loan, guys? We all want to get SBA loans.
Yes. I see our cultures for health right now is what you're on.
Yeah, I'm an average sourdough starter, guys. So like everybody else on your Instagram feed, I too have cooked bread very often and recently.
Actually, I saw something recently, maybe you can shed some light on it, but somebody was complaining about too many people doing sourdough. Like
Yeah,
it's very complicated, and so they're wasting flour by being inexperienced for the people who actually know how to make bread. Is that like a legitimate gripe, or is that just the
absolutely.
internet being the internet?
No, well, I could be in the sense that sourdough does take a ridiculous amount of flour to keep it going. And if you don't know, and it actually doesn't take that hard, it isn't that hard to get it started, but people don't know how to get it started. Like all it takes is rye flour. Rye flour has a ton of microbial activity on it. And that's the irony is that what's left in your grocery store right now is like rye flour, buckwheat flour, all this stuff. That's actually how you start sourdough. It's like you just put water with rye flour for in a day, you'll have like raging sourdough starter. But a lot of people are trying to start it from white flour, which is exactly right. They're buying a lot, they're trying it. And that's just a waste of time because it is very difficult to get started because you've stripped all of the microbes off. It's like what we do in wine. You know, we inoculate the grapes. There's all this yeast that comes directly from the specific place that it was grown. And what we do is we spray it with sulfur to kill it because we're afraid that it might not behave the way that I want it to behave. You know, we want to become the masters of nature. And ironically, 90% of terroir turns out to be the bugs that live in your vineyard. And what are bugs doing? They're transporting different yeast spores pretty much all the time. And so this is a big thing about natural fermentation in Georgia. And it's the same kind of thing. It's like, if you want to start sourdough, take a flour that has, you haven't stripped or inoculated, which is typically rye flour that has the husk and all that in there built up. And that's how you start sourdough. And then you slowly feed it white flour and it learns how to eat it. But it takes time. So I'm sure that that's probably the case.
Well, in May, I'm going to bring you back for the bread making class. So
Let's do it. Let's do it.
go ahead and do
We're
that.
just a big bread. But here's what I was just going to show you the Quiver. I mean, this is a kind of little diagram that's over here on the left. I imagine you can see my screen. Is that true? Yeah.
Yes.
So, and so, yeah, this little guy. So this is what Quiver. They're much larger than this. Obviously, the proportion to a man is actually a little bit it's not exactly true, but so Quiver are these large clay jars that are built by hand by individual Quiver makers, and so these are people who have. There used to be hundreds of them. Of course, there are now 5 or 6 sort of master Quiver makers, and they make these all by hand. And so they're then burying them, under the ground. And this is what they kind of look. These are some ancient Quevers that were dug up, sitting in an ancient monastery that has Quevers that are dating back almost 1,000 years. So the idea is that you bury them under the ground, and then once you've done that, you use them forever, right? And you see that some of these are coated on the outside with this was like proto-concrete, because the only thing that can really mess it up is an earthquake or some other problem, in terms of breaking it. Otherwise, you can clean it out as many times as you want and reuse it. And the idea about why you use clay in Quiver is that it's a neutral vessel. So a lot of times when I have to do this, I have to tell people, be like, oh, it's made in clay. And they're like, I really can taste the clay. And it's like, well, if you can, then we have a serious problem, because that means that this wasn't fired properly. These are food grade, in that respect. They're fired for over a month. So they're built by hand, and then they literally build the kiln around the Quiver, and they seal it up and they keep it fired for about 29 days. And then they make them all different sizes. So obviously the region in Calcetti, which is where the wine of the Orgo Roccazzatelli that I'm drinking in, they were the ones that made the largest Quiver. And so you have a huge wide variety of sizes, but the best winemakers that I know acknowledge that you really don't want to go above about 1,800 to 2,400 liters, which is still a crazy amount compared to like a barrel, right? Barrel fermentation is about 500 liters, something like that. But there are ones that range from 50 liters to all the way up to, some people have them at storage ones up to 4,000 liters. But 2,000 liters is a nice sweet spot for doing the fermentation and that whole process. So that's a little bit about how they look. I'm also going to show you a little map to kind of just talk about where we are too. So this is the country of Georgia. It has 9 distinct regions. All of the wines that we're working with today are focused in this one region called Kakheti. And so if we zoom out, which I can do, presumably, this is the inside of the region of Kakheti. You have a huge river valley. So up here up at the north is the Caucasus Mountains, which are the tallest mountains in Europe. And this also gives you a little sense of where Georgia is, because it's not intuitive, but it's along the same 42nd parallel, very south on the Black Sea. So you have what you don't see in this topographical map is that there's a huge mountain range that runs on the north side here, and then there's another large one that runs in the south side here. And so that creates this huge valley there. And so these are where this is our Georgia's Napa Valley. It's huge production. And I'll go a little bit closer to some of the distinct regions. The Origo that we're having here, some of that comes from Akhmeta. We'll talk about what I'm having here. And this is here, you see on the map is the Vardi Subani. This is where one of the main Qvevri makers who's still around makes them there. So each of the Qvevri makers is based in certain areas where they have good clay that's proper for obviously for using it in Georgia. But this is sort of the central part, very continental. As you get down to here into Gurjani, this becomes very California-like, hot. It's the closest to what we are, in the sense that here you're producing sometimes 14, 15% alcohol, not as hot as California, obviously. But here you have a very continental climate. It's very rare to see wines that get over 14% of alcohol. But again, that's changing. Obviously, the climate is changing in Georgia as well. Everything is becoming hotter. But the good news about Georgia is that all you have to do is move your vineyards up this way or up this way, and you get slightly higher elevations, and you're back down to 13% alcohol. Obviously, that takes a lot of infrastructure. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing that, but and go back to talk to you about the Qvevri. So you wanted to know about the process. So you saw those clay jars. They're egg-shaped. They're both egg-shaped for structure, so that they're not as easy to break. But originally they weren't egg-shaped. Originally they were flat-bottomed. But Georgians over 8,000 years discovered that their wines came out better if they were shaped like eggs. And the reason why is that when you're doing fermentation with skin contact, so when you press the juice into the Qvevri, you put the skins back in, both with your red and white wines. Fermentation starts, you have a cap, right? So you have a cap of that you have to be pushing down consistently, 2 or 3 times a day. And what happens with the conical shape is that you get a natural convection. So you have to push down anyway, but what happens is as the bubbles come up to the center, and it creates gas that comes up from the center, and there's a natural push back down along the sides, which helps bring the skins back down and creates, it doesn't revolve a lot, but if you watch it, you can see that it revolves. And then also you have the narrow base in the narrow tops as well. The tops can't be too narrow because those Qvevris, in order to clean them, you actually have to get inside of them. And so they're the bigger ones that are like 2,000 liters, they're made so that 2 grown men can fit inside, but you still have to be kind of like me, scrawny, get your shoulders in there. And you get down there and you have to clean it. So it's very laborious. And that's the biggest issue, it's the biggest issue in natural wine in general, is that if you want good wines in a low intervention way, hygiene has to be your most important part. So you're getting in there, you're climbing in there, you're cleaning it out. You're doing that about 5 or 6 times. And you're doing that about 5 or 6 times prior to harvest. And so you have to do it consistently. And then, yeah, so you funnel the juice, the fermentation's happening, this natural convection's happening. But the most important thing that happened about the conical shape is that during those 6 months, what's happening? Well, you have all of these grape skins and grape seeds that are still in the juice. There's no longer any fermentation that's causing its natural motion to bubble up, right? What happens is there's a natural filtration process that happens. So when you do it in a conical shape, as opposed to a big flat shape, what happens is that the seeds, which are the most tannic part. They actually go down into the nipple or the bottommost part of that clay jar, and then right away they get covered by some must, which means that the tannins are no longer leaching into the wine. And this happens over the first month. And then the skins as well, they start to go down and settle down. And so they create this cap. So the irony is that 6 months of skin contact doesn't necessarily mean more tannic. It all has to do with how much skin you added back and how much remontage, how much push down you're doing, and how hot your fermentation is. So you can actually have wines that are more tannic that only spent 3 months on the skins, because what happens after the first 3 months is the same thing that happens in red wine. So people don't age red wine on the skins for more than a month. The question is why? Main answer is because what happens after a month is that the pigment of the wine starts to go back into the skins, and people prize red wines that are darker, right? So even though the structure might be better, the wine actually might be better, you typically don't see it being aged on the skins. But with the amber wines, it's the opposite. They discovered that we have really hot fermentations, so we're getting a lot of extraction. We keep them longer for the second 3 months. What happens is there's actually the tannins are going back into the skins at the bottom, but again, it's a slower rate because they're not floated. There's less surface area. So there's all these sort of complex things that are happening. And the main goal for a winemaker is, typically to open up the Qvevri. That's the kind of majesty about Georgian wine, is that, really a lot of winemakers are just closing it up for 6 months and not tasting at all, which again, is anathema to modern winemaking. In modern winemaking, you're always tasting, right? You're taking thieves and stuff like that. And there's some people who do a hybrid. So these guys, he's a very skilled winemaker. His name is Gogi Dakishvili. He, in my opinion, is probably the best winemaker in Georgia because he's very experienced. So he would love to be thieving his wines. He'd love to be tasting them right now ahead of time, but he doesn't, which is strange because he's a very technical winemaker all the time, but he doesn't simply because this kind of duty that he feels to being Georgian, which is like, if I'm going to make this style of wine, I have to make it how it's supposed to be made. Even though prior to the closing of the Qvevri, he's very methodical and very sort of, he knows all the trick, he knows, all of the chemistry and all that kind of stuff. But he's like, I'm not going to, it's like my thing. It's like, I need to focus on doing everything right now. And then how it's going to turn out is, how I did it, at the time that I actually was allowed to intervene, because I'm not going to intervene any other time. You know what I mean? So it's a kind of an interesting philosophy that's in Georgia as well. So you do a lot in the vineyard, you do a lot more in the vineyard than a lot of places do, and you do a lot less winemaking. And you kind of created this tool that helps you do a lot of the stuff that a lot of modern winemaking is all about, intervening at certain times. And Georgia kind of has created these more holistic ways of managing tannin and managing, creating wines that are going to last longer. Again, it took them a lot longer than maybe modernity does, but there's a different kind of soul to it. So that's a little bit about Qvevri. There may be more specific questions about that.
No, I think that gives us, like a good overview and stuff like that, and how it's different. And I find it fascinating that they can just trust the process and let the wine do what it's going to do. So now, I think we should jump into some of the wines that we haven't touched on that you have in front of you, and I'm just going to kind of let you kind of just go nuts and see, how you want to go about that. So for that,
this is my typical lineup. To anybody who doesn't know Georgian reds, I find it one of the most instructional ways to do it, because Georgian's red is all about Saperavi, which is the dominant grape variety in Georgia for red wine. Saperavi, the root of the word is peri, which means color. The prefix sa means the place of color. So it's literally, Saperavi is the place of color. And that's because Saperavi is a dye, a dye. It's been used as a natural dye because it's one of the few grape varieties. It's about 13 Vitis vinifera grape varieties that its red skin is, so we know red grapes because they have red skin, but their flesh 90% of the time is actually white. That's why most champagne is made from Pinot Noir, right? A red grape, but you do it by pressing off this juice very softly and not getting any pigment from the skins. But Saperavi is the opposite. In order to make a Saperavi rosé, which can be done, it requires a lot of modern winemaking techniques because the juice actually has the pigment inside of it. And so Georgians, in Georgia, you can do everything with Saperavi. Saperavi actually was, it's not legally allowed to say, but Saperavi in Georgia is primarily drunk medicinally. Georgia is emphatically a white wine culture. It's emphatically drinking wines that are, a majority of the production of wine in Georgia is home wine, and majority of it has skin contact. So 70% of all production in Georgia is white wine. 30% of it is red, and of that 30%, about 25% of it's Saperavi. And the reason why for that is both because the Soviets invested in it, but because it is Georgia's probably the closest to Vin Noble grape that we have. And this is not, that's my opinion, but it's also the opinions of some masters of wine and other people I really respect. And the reason why we talk about Vin Noble, it's a wine, it means that it's a grape variety that shows terroir. It's very malleable, it's very sensitive to terroir. It's going to taste different in different places. And also, it's very malleable in a winemaker's hand. But at the same time, it has distinct varietal characteristics. And you can either highlight them based on terroir or whatever. But it's definitely going to taste like Saperavi. So Saperavi is why I do these three wines is because, again, this is modern introduction wine, just let's learn what a fresh young Saperavi tastes like so that you can understand the fresh fruits. So this is the Guardian Saperavi. So one main component of red wine is fruit, right? And this wine teaches you all about fruit. That's why I like to say it. So this is the Guardian Saperavi. This is younger. It's a 2018, but soon we'll be switching to the 2019s. It's a younger version of it. Which means that it's going to present a lot more fruit than what the other two are going to do. And that's important because fruit is a big component of Georgian wine. You can't talk about Saperavi without dark, brambly, black fruits. I mean, that is the spectrum that its fruits live on. It's sour cherry, it's a little touch of pomegranate, it's blackberry, and you can get even to the blueberry side of it, but it all lives in sort of that mulberry, blackberry, sour cherry, different kinds of cherries spectrum, right? And this highlights that with a touch of sweetness. So, that's the kind of thing. This is something that retails for about 13, 14 bucks, something like that. And it's that your sort of everyday wine. It pictures Maya on the label. So it talks about obviously Georgia defending wine for 8,000 years. And Maya, like I said, is sort of like the Georgian Mulan. She's a woman, but the less PG rated version is that she's a woman who's working for a corrupt, landlord basically at that time, baron who, basically rapes her and decides, I don't usually tell that on tastings, but you guys understand, it's fun to say, but you can understand it, that she basically is abused and she runs away. She dresses up like a man to survive. She works then on that time, basically being like Robin Hood. She starts stealing from this guy and bringing it to all the other people that he's abused and all the people that he's abusing. Then what happens? A Persian invader comes to Georgia, and like all good Georgians in times of war, what do? You drop your differences, whatever, you get together, you got to get rid of the Persians. So she goes dressed as a man, becomes, is honored in battle, basically, helps them stop this overthrow. She's discovered to be a woman later after that time, at the end of the battle. And even then, when she's discovered to be a woman, they're like, you got to get out of here. You know what I mean? So even though she helped save the thing, it's like, how it is. But it's, again, that indelible spirit, that obviously it has some history behind it. But what I like about the Saperavi, like I said, it's made by a young winemaker that helps support what I think the future is of Georgia by telling the stories of of bravery and getting through tough times, which we could all stand to understand that it does get better and it's easier. And, you know, women especially Georgian women that I know, embody this. Like, you know, in Georgia, there's a civil war in the 90s, you know, things fell apart. It was not the men who were holding it together. I can tell you as a man and understand they were the people who held the family together. And that's the kind of thing that we honor. So but that being said, it's easy to drink. It's got that story. It's bright, crisp. It's got nice acid. It's got those lovely fruits. It's a touch of sweetness at the finish, at the beginning, but at the finish, it's nice and tannic. And that's because Saperavi is a very tannic grape. And one of the ways to manage that tannin is by having a little bit of sweetness to it. And then that bridges you into the Dilao, which is your kind of intermediary. So the Dilao is the same winery. Orgo makes Dilao. It was exactly the same idea, is that we said, how do we bring Qvevri wine to more people? And the answer from distributors and other people is, well, you know, can we have it under $20? And we're like, well, that's going to be tough, right? But we were like, we worked together and said, we understand why that's important. You know, people need to pour things by the glass. People need to understand it. So the Dilao is a project where we came up with, the winemaker came up with a very creative system. He's got a limited amount of Qvevri, right? He's always going to make Orgo wines, which are made from old vines, 80-year-old vines, 50 to 80-year-old vines. And that's the core of the project. But they said, is there a way that we can produce a Qvevri wine that's good and we can get it to people at a price that's easier for them? And the ingenious way is that we said, well, let's do a hybrid. So what this does is that we reuse the Qvevris. Instead of only using them once a season, we pick a little bit earlier on the reds for this particular wine. What does that do? It means that the phenolic ripeness is a little bit less. You still got a lot of that bright fruit. You put it in the Qvevri for 1 month. You just let the fermentation happen, and then you put it into stainless steel. And then what they do is they wash those Qvevris really quickly, harvest the older vines later, so they have more phenolic ripeness and crisp, and they make that. So they're able to use their Qvevris twice as much. And with that, they make a crazy investment to be able to sell this wine at a price. And as importers, we pass that on, and we also take less money. Why? Because we want to have a wine where you can try it for under $20 and have that experience of what Qvevri wine is, so that you can learn about it. And Dilao is something that we started, together we've been working on it as a strategic project with all of you guys. And I can now say that this and their amber wine are the most well-known Georgian wines in the US right now. And they're the first Georgian wine where we actually had not enough demand. And again, I only say that because that means that there's something there. You know what I mean? There's something there. So the taste of it is different. No sweetness at all, but you still get all that fresh fruit, and it's really on the sour cherry. So this is more about the fruit and acid. So it's higher acid than this, more fruit, but made in Qvevri. So it's got a lot more tannin. And so you're not going to balance out the tannin at all with the sweetness. You're just picking it earlier so that the tannin is there, very prominent. So it's great to pair with food, but it's not as developed as what you're going to have in the Orgo. So that's kind of the Dilao. There's the Dilao. And the name of it, Dila is the name for morning. Dilao is a popular sing-along song. If you haven't had a chance, you should just, after this, Google Georgian polyphonic singing. And it's some of the most, I don't know what you think about music, but it's some of the most haunting and amazing music. So there's this 4-part polyphony where people are singing melodies over, and that's where that comes from. So Georgian dance and Georgian singing, which are featured on the label, are a big part of, like I said, if you're drinking wine in Georgia, you're supposed to be singing, reciting poetry, and dancing. That's how it works. And we could use a little bit more of that in the US. And then it's the Orgo. So I kind of glanced over it on the white, but Orgo is the project of the father and son of Gogi Dakishvili and Tamori Dakishvili. These guys are 4th and 5th generation winemakers in Georgia. And they have 3 hectares of vineyards that were planted by their great-grandfather. And the Saperavi are the oldest vineyards. It's 80 years old. But they have Kisi and Rakatsateli. And so they were making wine, and they always were making wine under, for themselves from this vineyard. But the biggest thing that they saw is that we talk about 8,000 years of winemaking in Georgia, but we don't have that much older vines in Georgia, which is crazy. And that's, again, a Soviet legacy. The Soviets ripped up, they were all about production. So once something gets over 20 years, it starts producing less, you rip it up, you plant new ones. And then Georgia had, there's a time of perestroika where the government had basically a prohibition endeavor where they also ripped up hundreds of, tens of thousands of acres of Georgian wine, primarily in this region where you had Saperavi. So they found it as their legacy that says, we have these older vines, but there's other people, other growers who are not winemakers, and they get paid by the kilo, and they're ripping up these amazing old vineyards. We have to do something to stop it. So they make 10,000 bottles of this particular wine. And the other part to make it 10,000 bottles is they have long-term contracts with these growers who otherwise would be ripping up their vineyards. And so they have long-term contracts saying, don't rip them up. We will guarantee to buy your grapes. It's part of our history. We need to continue that down. And so this wine is just a very, very complex and sort of, but at the same time, it's all his wines are, they're not a ton of edginess to them. They're round. They're clearly really well-made wines, but again, really well-made wines without any tricks. You know what I mean? It's just doing your work in the vineyard, letting the natural yeast work, and monitoring, make sure that everything's clean, and adding a small amount of sulfites. Again, that's a big question in the natural wine world, but he adds just a tiny amount of sulfites so that he's under 50 parts per million, but his wines are super clean and super round. So this is something that here we were talking a lot about fruit, right? Here, fruit is there, but it's not the main event. The main event is the mid palate and the finish. So the mid palate here brings out the other main part of Georgian Saperavi, which is you're going to get a lot of earth, a bit of spice, and chocolate and other coffee notes, depending on the vintage and the terroir. So chocolate and coffee. And so you're going to get those secondary notes, and then it's going to finish strong with a wide breadth of tannin. Never usually dusty on him. He's managing the phenolic ripeness of his grapes, choosing when. So the tannins are elegant and round, but they're definitely prominent. And this is something that, could age for 10 to 15 years easily. And so he's trying to make wines that are both elegant right now, but that he could have, building a history of his cellar. And so we have his first vintage was 2012, and under this label. And the word orgo obviously makes you think of organic and natural, which again, that's what they're practicing, organics. But it's also the symbol that's at the top here is orgo also means the name of the top of the qvevri. So when you seal it up for 6 months, you use the piece called an orgo to seal it up. So this is the circle both to that, but it's also an ancient symbol, which is this, it's called the perpetual motion machine. So it's supposed to be a symbol of eternity. So that their symbol is that their idea is that the eternity of the sun living in the bottle. So that they're just part of this ongoing winemaking project, and they're just capturing it for us every year. And so, yeah, so I think this is a great introduction. There's so many other great wines that you guys carry, that we have, that tell a lot of other stories in Georgia. But in terms of getting to know Georgian wine, getting to know Skin Contacts, getting to know Saperavi, this is a great lineup. Like if you want to see, after this lineup, you really could understand the grape variety, because it shows you modern, hybrid, and sort of ancient, but ancient with an elegant twist. It's somebody who knows, and so it's a great kind of 3-tier way to get into Saperavi. And then obviously the Skin Contact, there's so much to go on, but I feel like you have to kind of get acquainted with one first, and I think the Orgo does that well. I didn't talk about that much, but it teaches you that you're not looking for fresh fruit, you're looking for dried fruit, you're looking for, drinks a little bit more like a tea, and not everybody knows tea, but it's got this weight that's kind of like a red, but it's not. This is definitely the funky, the weird, bring you to a whole new level. Whereas Saperavi is something that like you can see its quality, but I also feel that it's different than, you know, whatever. I do this for a living, right? And we present this to wine buyers, and every single wine buyer tells me it tastes like some other grape variety. You know, some tell me it tastes like Cab Franc, some tell me it tastes like Syrah, some tell me it tastes like, you know, obscure Italian varieties. And you're like, great, you know, but that's what I want, is I want them to see that it's in different forms. It's really, really different. And, you know, it's an interesting variety. So, and these are just two of the varieties. I mean, there's 40 other in commercial production. And a lot of what we do is work with people who are literally saving these grape varieties from extinction. And, you know, sometimes you get in California 48 bottles or 60 bottles, you know, because I got 100, right? And, but for us, it's worth it, you know, because we can help this grape variety from going from extinction and hopefully, you know, eventually thriving.
So speaking of, you know, the extinction of like grapevines and even the, you know, the Quiveri makers, considering that there's so few of them, you know, this fight that you guys have taken up to preserve tradition and, you know, also kind of embrace the new, but like, how do you feel like it's going so far? Like, what's the reaction been? I mean, do you feel like you're making progress?
Totally. You know, it's a tough time for everybody now, and there's a lot of uncertainty as to where we are, which is, you know, at one point you could be a little discouraged, because I think we are definitely on the right trajectory, you know, and I feel like it's taken a lot of time and it's taken a lot of effort on a lot of people's parts. But the last 3 years have just been growth all around for Georgia. You know, again, that growth is tiny compared to other winemaking regions. You know, Georgia would love to have 1%, 0.5% of the U.S. wine market, which would mean that we are selling somewhere between about 6 million bottles to the U.S. Georgia would love that. That would be, you know, a tenth of their entire production, right? And what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years is that the exports of Georgian wine to the U.S. have grown, but the exports haven't. We have an opposite tendency than most other winemaking regions. So our exports have both grown, and the price of exports have also grown, which is crazy, because normally it's as you export more, you're getting more into a volume market. You'd see that like the prices are either stay steady or go down. But what we've seen is that means that we're getting more and more smaller producers into the market. And there are more and more, you know, a lot of restaurants and bars. I mean, to be frank, a lot of our success in Georgian wine was after succeeding in the restaurant business, which is, it's hope, you know, I know that landscape is going to be drastically different, you know, whenever that changes, you know, and that's tough to see, because there's so many people who have supported us, supported you guys, in terms of telling the story of Georgian wine by being able to say, hey, you know, I'm going to take less margin on an Orgo Saperavi or on a Baez wine because I believe in the people who are doing it. And that's what I think I've seen the success of Georgian wine, is that the stories resonate with people, especially with storytellers and people who want to do it. And I think we are just on the cusp of saying, okay, how do we do better with retailers, and how do we do better with the average consumer about telling that story as well, you know, meeting them on their level. But the long and short is that, you know, last year exports were up. We're still under 1 million bottles, but I think we were on pace to make 1 million bottles of imported, not just us, but the whole country of Georgia. That obviously is going to have a big setback because of where we're at right now. But we were definitely on there. And so I'm still positive though, because I think once things bounce back, you know, we're still getting a lot of people reaching out to us and saying, hey, I'm not selling wine from, you know, the big guys. Tell me what I can sell of yours, you know, and that's what's happening with us, which has been really great, which is that they say people, even in tough times, are committed to wines. And that's what I think Georgia has, that even if it's but what we've had the success is that it's like, okay, even if it's the introduction wine, people that we've worked with can understand, you know, that they can bring the high-end small guys, but we're a whole community, and the rising tide raises all boats. And I think that's the perspective that we've had. And honestly, I think that's the perspective of the wine agency of Georgia, which is amazing. You have to think about this, most wine agencies that are promoting exports of wine, they're all about volumes. But the wine agency of Georgia is just a great example, is that they made Qvevri wine, small production wine, the centerpiece of their strategy. You know what I mean? And that's so important because they're like, we're Georgian. We make wine in Qvevri. Maybe it's only 5% of the wine that we make, but that's what we want to be known for, right? And so that's crazy to think that 10, 15 years ago they were like, yeah, let's make that the centerpiece of what we are. And it took a long time, but I think like I said, it's growing, and so the last 5 years have been great. And I'm sure once we get back on track and we reset, people are going to be thoughtful about where they put their dollars, and I think Georgian wine is definitely a place to where they can be making an impact. I just, the last thing I would say is I just really think it really resonates with consumers when even if they want to be push funky, it's like when you buy a bottle of this wine, or when you buy a bottle of Baya's wines, or even when you buy this wine, the Guardians, you're helping somebody with a face. It's an actual person, and it makes direct economic impact, on that person. Like these guys, they at home, they were making, like I said, they were making 10,000 bottles. They were making 20,000 bottles. They were considered medium size. When we were able to come to them with the opportunity of Dilao, and they were able to come together, and you say, hey, we want you to be a strategic partner of to bring more wines to more people, and we're able to sort of double their production, right? That allows them to invest more in their vineyards, buy more things, be an example to other people about how it is that what the right strategy is in the US. So it's always a fine line. That's what we're tasked with in this life, is to find the good balance about all the smart things that humans have learned before us, and how we can make them alive and real today and put our little, spin on it. And, that's what we're called to do, right? And Georgians, I think, understand that in a unique way, where they're like, let's play the long game, we're in it to win it, as long as Russia doesn't take us over, we're we've got a long-term strategy. So I think that'll pay dividends, even when things are a little bit different. So I'm encouraged. That's all, the long and short. I wish we didn't have a pandemic, but I'm encouraged.
So I have one final question for you, and then we'll open it up and see if anybody else has any questions. But I do think this is a very complex topic, and there's so many layers. And Noel, you've done a really, really great job of just diving in, and you hit us with so much information, but I don't feel overwhelmed. I just feel like way more educated on it. Now, we usually don't get an hour and a half to pitch Georgian wines. And, and even if we do get turned on to it, we always want to drink with our friends and stuff like that. So I have a timer set right now, and I think this will be difficult for you just because you have too much knowledge. But what is your 30-second Georgian wine pitch that other people can use?
Before you set the timer, am I talking to salespeople, or is what I do in an in-store and I'm talking to a consumer, or is it to a buyer? That's what I need to know. Tell me who the audience.
Oh boy,
buyer or consumer. But that's what I want to know. Buyer or consumer.
Buyer. Okay, buyer.
Buyer.
Right. I mean, if we do, we can do two, because this will be, if we did it a minute, it's still less than any other conversation that you've had tonight. So so let's start with buyer.
Yeah. So I would say to the buyer, I saw you had some really interesting wines from Austria, or you had something from New Zealand, or I see that you're interested in wines that are, with skin contact or whatever it is, right? And have you ever tried any Georgian wines? And I would say, what I think is that if you're interested in wine, it's really, Georgian wine offers you something that you can't ignore, which is namely that there's ancient varieties made in ancient techniques. Maybe you know skin contact, maybe you don't. But I think if you really ought to try these wines, because there's 8,000 years of continuous winemaking tradition. I mean, have you ever tried a Ricatatelli before? Or have you ever tried a Saperavi before? You should try it. It's interesting, right? These are indigenous varieties. Georgia has about 525 of them. And the cool thing is that natural wine, whatever you think about it, Georgia is the birthplace of wine, but it's also this resurgence of, you know, the interest in the winemaking. The wine community is where people are interested in wines that are different, and they're interested in wines that present a story. And what Georgia has is an unparalleled story and great wines. And then I would say, I'm going to shut up. And if you don't believe me, you should try this wine and tell me what you think about it. Because I think it's really cool. You know, and then if I was talking about a specific wine, obviously I would talk about the story that I think would work best with them, which is namely, if it's somebody who's like Cabernet or whatever, then I would probably go after them with the Orgo. If it's somebody who is more interested in funky skin contact wine, then, you know, I go after them with the Tevzo or the Nawatari and just say, I see you have that wine on your list. I see that wine right over there. You like that? Oh, that's what I'm doing. So it's a lot of it for me on buyers is research. So that's past my 30. That's now that's meta, but you know, that's
That
not
that was a long elevator ride. I'll say that.
Sorry, man. But I would
Okay.
say, have you ever tried Georgian wine? No. Oh, it's the birthplace of wine. Do you like wine? For the consumer, I would just say this: when I'm trying to, here's my consumer pitch, which I do all the time. I do tons of in-store tastings. So like, would you like to try some wines? I've got wines from the birthplace of wine, and people say, "What's that?" And I say, "Well, it's where wine began. It's the place where people first started domesticating wines." I say, "Well, that's interesting. So what do you have?" Well, I have a white, I have a red, I have a white wine that tastes like a red that you've never tried before, and I've got, you know, maybe a semi-sweet red. And everybody says, "Oh, I'd like to try the wine that I've never tried before." And it's like, "Yeah." They're like, "What's that?" And I say, "Well, it's because this is a white wine made like a red." And they're like, "Well, they don't know how red wine is made, right?" And so, well, it's where you add the skins mixing. So it's gonna feel like a red, but it's gonna taste like with a white. And I say, try it, right? And then once I get people to try, so the main goal is how do you get them to try? And I just say, have you tried wine from the birthplace of wine? This is a crazy, and I don't usually go crazy, but it's like, what do you normally like? And then I would say, but I like to do that pitch where if I have an amber, I can say, everybody's going to stop and say, well, if you say that this is a wine you've never had before, you've never even tried, it doesn't make any sense to you, people will try it. Whether they're going to love it, I don't know, but they will then try through the lineup. So that's typically what I do with the consumer is like, then I try to grab them with that kind of a little bit of a challenge, you know, just to say like, you've never tried this wine before. You should, like, they're going to be like, is it a Cabernet? It's like, no, you've never tried this before. It's completely different. You like Cabernet? You should try that. You know, or yeah.
And we did have one question. I didn't see it earlier, but the question was like, I think it had to do in regards to like when the Soviet Union was running things. Have you had any of the wines from that era?
I've had a 50-year-old Saperavi and a 50-year-old Ricatatelli that were smuggled out of the old collection that somebody bribed them to get out from the Soviet collection. So the Soviets did keep vintages from everything. What I would say is that the winemaking I'm not so confident in from that time, but the amber wine, it was alive. It showed it was, you know, still kicking, which is really interesting. The Saperavi as well, you know. So all of them were, that's all I mean to say is like winemaking, not that great, but the varieties themselves still, you know, they still held true. They weren't gone bad, you know what I mean? So that's something to say is that even if, you know, not in the best hands, the varieties are drinking there. None of them are available. Yeah, that's the problem. The thing is that aged wine in Georgia is very difficult to find. So the irony is that some of the wines that this guy's produced, I have more of the wine than he does because I've saved it, you know, for me, you know, like 12 or 18 bottles or whatever. Because our model when this business was started in 2004 is like, well, if we thought, you know, who's going to buy Georgian wine? We didn't quite know. There was probably people who were quite naive. Like anybody in the wine business, like if you bring a container of wine, people are just going to buy it, right? But we were a little bit more sober-minded. They were a little bit more sober-minded. They said, whatever wine we're going to bring, we're going to be able to drink. And to be honest, those first years, there's a lot of wines that got saved. So, you know, and we've got a kind of interesting history. And that was literally the first thing when I talked to my owner, you know, the guy who I work very closely with. you know, when this whole thing started shutting down, it's like, well, we're gonna have a lot of wine, a lot of the wines that we love to drink. So that's not the worst problem to have, right?
Right. That's a really optimistic way to look at it.
But you know, aged wines are just tough, you know. So like, you know, like I said, we don't. The oldest wine that we have of in some quantity is the 2014 Charleroi Saperavi, and we just brought the last 600 bottles that exist. We stole them from the Japanese, and I can tell you, man, that wine is killer right now. It's just, I mean, it's going through a good time, you know, and that's how wine is, you know. If you want to age a wine for 30 years, it might not be great for 5 years, you know, and then it changes again, and then 5 years later, all of a sudden it's drinking really great. And I've definitely seen that with amber wines a lot. You know, things have their moments, and then, but you don't, with those wines, you don't have to give up on them. You know what I mean? So like that's what I've experienced is like a lot of the wines, there's this, for example, amber wines go through a sort of a 3-5 year peak. And then it's a little bit question like what's going to happen after those 5 years. And I've had the experience where I know where a wine's going after 3 years and I'm like really on it. And after 5 years, I'm really on it. And then the 7-year mark, I've tried them and I'm like, not great. But then we got to the year 10 and they were fantastic again. So that's why I think amber wines have, if anybody is cellaring, which is great, those are like really awesome, low investment wines that will like be really interesting, you know, at different times. So, you know, I only know that because I'm probably one of the very few people who have done that, you know. So, and that's just because I own a business where I have a warehouse where I can do that.
Yeah.
So,
are there any other questions from anybody else? I know we've talked a lot tonight, but does anybody else want to ask Noel a question before we let him go?
Hey, Noel, Robert here. I don't really have a question, man. I just wanted to say that I really think you hit it on the head when you said talking about the human aspect when you're talking to people about these for the first time is really that humanism of the people making it, and then the origins of you know, the historical origins of it. So I just wanted to emphasize that I'm really into that. And also, man, I just wanted to say you are totally incredible, man. You are why I love working in this industry. Like your passion and knowledge for this is unreal. I really appreciate it.
Agreed.
I really, but I have to say, so, I mean, I appreciate that a lot, you know, and it's great to be working with, I feel the same, you know, for me, a lot about the industry is finding people who understand that and are willing to join in that mission. And I'm always amazed, you know, back in the day when we had very few distributors, I'm always amazed, you know, now we have a lot more, but I'm amazed that people jump on and say yes and get inspired. So it's really great to have people like you guys, all of you here that work with JVS, many of you are here that, you know, you have no reason to like it other than the wine itself. You know what I mean? And that's what gives me a lot of hope about Georgia's, because I think the wines really do speak for themselves. I'm glad that I can be an ambassador to that. But, you know, it's great to find people who that resonates with, you know, right? So and I know you each have your own passions, and I'm interested in them too.
Well, Noel, thank you so much. You know, I do appreciate you, you know, spending time, you know, with us. I know it's a little bit later on that side of the country, so we're gonna let you go. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. You know, again, this is something about you know, learning something. I think this is by far been the most educational one that I've done so far, which is really great. And then you know, we got Sam Philness will be on tomorrow talking JVS and whiskeys and whatever else we can pry out of him. And then Wednesday we have Esteban from Derimbas and the Bacanora that we're working with, Bonete, all that fun stuff. So it should be a good rest of the week, and then the rest of the month is also packed in. And then in May, which I might have to plan out too, I'm going to bring Noel back and we're going to talk bread. So, but yeah, so thank you guys, thank you Noel, and cheers everybody.
Yeah, I was going to say we can't. Georgians would kill me. You have to drink a toast in Georgia. Wine is a sacred beverage. It was a food, it was a beverage, it's a way of life. And let's drink, I want to drink a toast. In Georgia, you're drinking many toasts, and Val can attest to this, and other people who've been around Georgians, toasting is a way of life, it's a way of drinking. But I want to toast to each one of you. I want to toast to, which is namely to say a toast to wine, which is an amazing product that has, again, since the dawn of alcohol, which is probably one of the earliest agricultural products in the ever, it has united people. And it's like Robert and you said, is that it's this strange beverage that connects us both with history and time. It can bring us back to the very origins of what humanity is, but it's also something that we share in together right now and have the very same experience almost as we did, since humans began. And so I know that I'm connected to each one of you because of wine. I know that I'm connected to the people that I work with in Georgia because of wine. And I know that there's something important. There's some strange, mysterious thing about alcohol and wine that's not simply about just getting drunk, but it's more about community, and it's about supporting each other and being in relationship with each other. So to each one of you who love wine the way that I do, and to wine itself, let's toast to wine as it's a great uniter. And thank you so much for having me. And let's talk bread and wine anytime. All
Right,
our
cheers.
say in Georgia.
Cheers. Thank you guys. Have a good night.
Night, guys.